Entonces, la siguiente, préstame ahí la... Si de casualidad se restablece la comunicación con Tim, pues trataremos de recuperarlo. Our next speaker, la doctora Tania Ngapo. Ngapo is the correct pronunciation? Napo. La doctora Tania Ngapo, ella también trabaja para Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Nos va a hacer una presentación sobre preferencias de los consumidores mexicanos, un proyecto que se hizo con datos de aquí de México, espero que les resulte interesante. La doctora Tania tiene doctorado en Ciencia de la Carne en el Departamento de Biotecnología e Ingeniería de Bioprocesos en Nueva Zelanda, en la Universidad de Massey. Trabajó como investigadora en Food Science Australia y en el INRA, también en Francia, que fue ahí donde se empezó a involucrar en las cuestiones de las investigaciones relacionadas con los consumidores. Tiene más de 50 publicaciones y es miembro de varias asociaciones, incluyendo la Canadian Meat Science Association y la European Pig Producers and the Canadian Consumer and Market Demand Network. Bienvenida, doctora Tania. Welcome, Dr. Tania. One, two, three, sí.
Okay, is this working? Okay. I'm sorry, I also don't speak Spanish, so to sweeten you guys up a little bit, I bought some maple lollies. And also because I figured 2 English speeches in a row, you might start falling asleep, so a bit of sugar to the brain is probably good. I also, after listening to Claudia, I wish I could speak Spanish because I think I could fit twice as much into my speech if I could speak that fast. But anyway, I was asked today to speak about a project that was actually undertaken by Dr. Nelson Huerta when he was working for the U.S. Meat Export Federation in Mexico City, and he invited me to be a part of the project at the later stages. So for me, it's actually a privilege to be able to present these results to you today, and I'm going to present them much as I would write a publication. So by way of introduction, I hope this is going to work. I will give you some statistics. First, we want to talk about consumption of meat in Mexico. These are results from data from 2015. Per capita consumption is about 12 kilos of pork a year and 8.6 kilos of beef, which adds up to about 2 million tons of each a year. Now, this sounds like a lot, but when you compare it to Canada and the US, you guys don't eat that much. So there's room for improvement, okay? We do know now also that consumption is increasing both in beef and pork. It's a lot less in beef than in pork. Pork is actually on a bigger incline. But these are Mexican results. In some other countries like Canada and the US, the inclines are actually greater. When we look at the production in Mexico, we find that in pork, production doesn't actually meet consumption. In beef, it's actually greater than consumption, but then we export meat elsewhere, so we fall lower than the consumption requirements. And if we do a simple trade deficit, we find that we require quite a lot of meat. This is actually just a simple trade deficit. If we look at the cuts that the Mexican consumer actually wants, we find that the deficits are actually greater. So we import meat. But in beef, we find that we can actually import and cover what's required. In pork, there's actually room for more imports to come into Mexico. Most of these imports, well, not most, but a big percentage of the imports come from the USA. This data is a little old, 2002. However, in 2002, 40% of beef in retail was actually from the USA, in Mexico, we're talking about. And 85% of pork imports came from the USA, and that's more recent data for pork. Most of the imports go to processing and large retail. But looking at the large percentage of imports from the USA, it's important that we understand in Mexico what the consumer wants and what we're importing, and is it meeting what the consumer wants? Now, it's an important market for Mexico, but the exports are also important for the US because exports to Mexico comprise 34% of US pork exports, which is huge, and 20% of US beef exports. So it's really important that the US understand what they're sending to Mexico and is it meeting what the Mexican consumer wants. I'm puffing a bit because Mexico City. Why does it come from the US? Well, it's pretty logical. The US has high production efficiencies, it's close to Mexico, there's an availability of the high demand cuts because the cuts are not the same in the US as what they are here in terms of consumer demand. And agreements like NAFTA, which make it easy for trade, but we don't actually know what the future of NAFTA is. So hopefully you guys might start buying more meat from Canada soon. So the objective of this particular project was to gain an overview of fresh US meat that's sold in supermarkets in Mexico. And it was undertaken in 5 Mexican cities where most imported US meat is sold. The project has been completed, and there are 2 publications that are out there if you are interested in having a look. They're in Meat Science. Now we move on to the methods. So first of all, we started with small pilot surveys that were undertaken just in the Mexico City district. People went out, and just to get an overview of what was actually there. So first of all, looking at the imports of primals and subprimals, looking at the Mexican names and what were the US equivalent names and the NAMP codes. Same thing for retail cuts. Some of them didn't actually have a US equivalent, so then we did translations. And in the retail cuts, we looked at fat levels and quality grade of beef. Now, ground meat could not be included because we couldn't actually validate the origin. So this is just, you don't have to look at the details, it's just to give you an idea of what the pilot surveys gave us. It was tables of information that we could then take out for the full surveys. So you have, for example, the cut, the US name, the Mexican name, US name, and the NAMP codes. And then we took these out into the full surveys. And these were undertaken in 3 regions of Mexico, which are considered the most important economically. And 5 cities in these 3 regions were selected, and they account for 60% of food sales in Mexico. The number of supermarkets that was visited was weighted on the regional populations of the regions, the regional populations. And 3 to 6 supermarket chains were visited per city. So not supermarkets, but supermarket chains. 1 visit was undertaken per store between 10 and 4, and these were undertaken in April to August of 2008. And they were undertaken by US Meat Export Federation personnel who had been trained in store by a meat scientist as to what to look for. This is where the surveys were undertaken. We undertook about 1,000 beef packages and almost 350 pork packages. Because of the regional weighting that we gave in terms of population, there was a strong bias for Mexico City, but that's accounted for in the statistics. So now we move on to the results. These are the imports that were observed in the stores during this, what we call an audit. You see that there are a lot more beef cuts than there were pork cuts. However, in the pork, there was a group called unidentifiable. Those were pieces of meat that could not be identified as to what they were actually supposed to be, which is kind of odd. But for both cuts, we found that the milanesa was the most prevalent, but in pork, the trozos was almost as much as the milanesa. And in pork, we also had chuleta, which was quite important. In beef, the beefsteak, of course, was the second most prevalent. Now, if we look at the sources of where this meat comes from, we find that in pork, the leg was by far the most prominent source. And this is quite different from what occurs in the United States. In the United States, the leg and the loin would pretty much be switched around. So this is really good for the US in terms of exporting, because it's a meat cut that they don't really want so much, so they can export it to you guys. In terms of beef, it's pretty much the same as what you would find in the US. The round is the most prominent, most prevalent source. The other thing that you should note from this is that 75% of the loin was used for chuleta. I don't know if I'm pronouncing things correctly, but I hope you understand. In terms of visual traits of meat, the meat in Mexico is extremely lean. And what we found was that 93% had 0 to 3.2 millimeters of trim. I just want you to think about what 3.2 millimeters actually is. It's tiny, okay? And the highest amounts were found in the chuleta and the beefsteak. In the marbling, same sort of results, 86% of 0 to slight. Now, slight is extremely small. This is slight marbling in pork, and that is actually, it looks like more marbling than what it actually is, because when I scanned the image, it kind of came out as though there was a lot of marbling. In beef, this is slight marbling. So this is the highest amount that you find in Mexico generally, from the imports. In terms of bone, pretty much all the bone was in the chuleta, and the beef grade from the US was 75% select and 25% choice, which goes pretty well with the marbling. Now, if we look at the 5 cities that we studied and try and see are there any differences in terms of the meat cuts that we find in those cities, we found that the two most prevalent had the same ratio pretty much in all 5 cities. So the milanesa and the beefsteak, in terms of beef I'm talking about here, were the same across all 5 cities. There were no differences. In the pork, however, we found that in the 3 more central cities, we had about 50-50 milanesa trozos. When we went to Guadalajara, we found that there were about, it's almost the same ratio, but it's 40-40 about, of the unidentifiable category and the milanesa. And then when we go to Monterrey, we find 50% unidentifiable, and then the next most prevalent is the chuleta, which was 24%. So there's a big difference in the northern city. We did a risk analysis on the data, which is not something that's commonly done in meat science, and we found that if you lived in Mexico City, you're 9 times more likely to find milanesa than if you lived in Monterrey, and 3 times more likely to find the trozos, but 90% less likely to find chuleta, and 90% less likely to come across these pieces of meat that we couldn't identify. We looked at the retail chains, so the different retail chains that we studied. We found that there really was no big difference here. One chain had lower external fat in pork, and one chain had high external and seam fat in beef, but really there was no significant difference. However, we also asked the personnel of the retail chain who was the consumer that they were targeting, what was their socioeconomic status. 89% of stores said that they targeted medium to high socioeconomic status. In beef, there was absolutely no effect. But in pork, again, we found that in Mexico City and Querétaro, there were pretty much all the stores targeted the medium socioeconomic status. They weren't targeting the high and they weren't targeting the low. In Guadalajara, León, and Monterrey, they were targeting the medium and the high socioeconomic status consumer. And in Monterrey, we also had 3% of stores that were targeting the low socioeconomic status, but there were no other regions that were targeting low socioeconomic status. We're talking about big supermarket chains here. This meant that we found differences with socioeconomic status. And in fact, what we found is that the stores that were targeting high socioeconomic status had the same trends as the stores that were targeting the low socioeconomic status, which is really weird. They had about between 20 and 30% of milanesa trozos and unidentifiable. This is for pork, okay? And about 12 to 16, so about half again of chuleta. And the stores that were targeting just the medium socioeconomic status, you had a lot less chuleta, so that meant you had less bone, less fat as well. And we also found that in the stores that were targeting high socioeconomic status, you were 6 times more likely to have loin sauce than in the stores targeting medium socioeconomic status. In terms of marbling, there were absolutely no differences. So now I'm going to kind of put this into perspective. How does this fit into the big picture? First of all, when I think of the United States and the value of their dollar versus the value of the Canadian dollar or the Mexican peso, the US dollar is actually worth a lot more, if you like. So one of the questions we had was, how can it be sustainable to actually export meat to Mexico and still make money on it? And what we discover is that they're exporting the relatively cheap cuts of meat in terms of beef and pork. However, when the meat comes here, it's reduced, it's very labor-intensive processes that take place. So it's highly reduced, it's sliced, and it's trimmed. But the US market is using the low labor costs that exist here in Mexico. So they're not processing the meat in the United States and sending it down here already sliced. They're using the lower labor costs in the Mexican market to make it a sustainable practice. And also, by cutting it up into smaller pieces, you're able to sell smaller packages. So when we look at, whoops, I'm not sure what I did there. When we look at the cheap labor source, the cheap source of meat, and the small pack size, it is actually able to be a sustainable practice. However, when we look at the portion of the food expenditure that goes into meat in the Mexican, whoops, I can see, I think Tim is back. When we look at the proportion of food expenditure that is spent on meat by the Mexican consumer, it's about a quarter of the food expenditure, and that's it's generally the low value cuts that are sold here. So this would indicate that in Mexico, price is a driving factor for meat purchase. However, I also want to mention that this is a pretty standard chart. In Canada, it's pretty much the same. In the US, it's pretty much the same. Meat is also a really, really important part of food expenditure. But in Canada and the US, you're often talking about much higher value cuts. When you look at the literature, it does suggest that price is a driving factor. We find that high income, these are all Mexican studies, high income consumers generally go for chops, loins, and ribs. The middle income are more likely to go for the pulp, the piece, or the ground meat. We also find that with an improving economy, consumers generally tend to prefer higher quality beef, and that preferences are evolving, and particularly amongst the affluent consumer. These are all Mexican studies, but this is not specific to Mexico. This is relevant pretty much throughout the world. And when we look at our results, we find that in Monterrey, where we had a high proportion of high socioeconomic status consumers targeted, we also had a high proportion of loin cuts. So that would suggest that, yes, we're in line with these studies. However, when we look at Leon, what we find is that we also had 50% of the stores were targeting high socioeconomic status, but we had no loin cuts. So it's never, ever that simple. And for me, I always think that price is a driving factor when we get to a certain level. But there are a lot of other things that come into play. And in other studies that we've done here in Mexico with Dr. Maria Rubio and Diego Braña, we discovered that when we ask the consumer, what are the most important characteristics that you use when you buy meat, price actually is the 6th or 7th characteristic that they say. And it always comes out after what they consider quality indicators. So things like color, freshness, the amount of liquid on the surface, things that they think are going to give them a good eating quality. And this is not unique to Mexico either. This is pretty much the same throughout the world again. But when we ask them, do you think meat is expensive? 63% of consumers say that yes, beef is expensive, but 82% of consumers say that no, pork is not expensive, which would indicate that for beef, price is probably more of a driving factor than for pork. Oops. I really like cooking, I really like eating. And so when I travel, I notice that, I think I've skipped a slide here. Hang on, we'll just go back. Uh-oh. Sorry. I don't know how to do this. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. So you have to look at all that again, but in fast motion. Okay. There's a quiz after this, so I hope you're all looking. So in terms of cooking, what we found in some of the studies that we've done, when we ask consumers, what is the most popular way that you cook meat, and I don't know why, but it's not coming up, we find that in Mexico, about 40% of consumers say that they boil or stew both beef and pork. We have about 40% who say they fry pork and 40% who say they roast beef. But otherwise, it's really, really low. And grilling is really surprising because there's a huge amount of meat called meat for grilling, I think, in Mexico. And only 5% of consumers say that they grill meat. So, and this is not exports, this is meat in general. When we look at the US, we find that about 3% of consumers say that they boil or stew meat. Whereas I think it's about 70% say that they grill meat. So it's a huge, huge difference in terms of the style of cooking. And so I wonder, are people buying the cheap cuts because they have these recipes that they like, that are really good with these cheap cuts of meat? Or have they developed these recipes because they can only afford to buy the cheap cuts of meat? So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg type scenario. But price, for me, it's never that simple. There are other things that come into play. There's disposable income, tradition, what did your mother used to cook, what did your grandmother cook, familiarity. When you go to the supermarket, are you used to seeing chuleta in the store that you buy your meat from? Do you know what to do with it when you buy it? Habit. Do you always have roast chicken on Sunday afternoon, for example? And time. Do you have time to spend cooking these recipes that require a lot of boiling and playing around, basically? So now I'm going to move back onto the leanness. I already mentioned that the trim was really, really low, and the average marbling of the imports we actually found was 2.26%, which is actually, it fits within the US Pork Board recommendation. However, we found that 67% was of levels 1 to 2, which is really, really low. And in terms of external fat, 71% was devoid. So this is the sort of thing that we're looking at. Beef was pretty much the same. When we look around the world, we see that this is the same sort of thing that consumers want all around the world, that consumers want lean meat because they think it's healthier. They think if they have to cut the outside off, it's a big waste of money. And it's a dilemma for the industry because the industry believes that you need marbling and a little bit of fat around the edge to have a good taste. And this is actually, it's interesting for me because the most prized meat around the world are things like this in Japan. And the next one, this in Spain. This is called the Ferrari of meat in Spain. And it's really, really expensive. But in Mexico, people say that they love meat for its taste. 90% of consumers say that they like pork for its taste, and yet the levels of fat would indicate that probably they're not getting the best taste that they could have. A few years back, I actually did a literature review looking at what impacts the taste of pork, and what I found that, in fact, only half of the literature says that low fat levels compromise taste. The other half of the literature says that low fat levels have a better flavor, and there's a few studies that show that there is no difference. And I'm wondering, and I think that I should go back and have a look at the literature, is most of the literature that talks about fat content based on grilling data? And what happens when we stew and boil meat? Does the fat actually have such an important place in terms of taste? So I'm going to go back and have a look. Another thing that we did here in Mexico is we went out and we showed consumers images of pork and beef that had 2 levels of marbling and fat cover. In terms of marbling, there was either no marbling or about 2% marbling. And what we found is that in pork, most consumers were not interested in marbling, and it's possibly because at those levels you don't really see it that much. In beef, we found that 60% of people said they didn't want marbling, and this is only 2%. This is very small. However, when we showed consumers a whole range of levels of marbling and fat cover, we found, and this is good for the industry, we found that most consumers do not want the really high levels of marbling and fat, but they have like a range in the lower levels. They don't all want the most extreme lean meat. So for industry, this is really good because at the moment, with the trimming levels that we have and the natural variation, we are actually able to respond to that variation. This weekend, I was very lucky to be able to go and eat some highly marbled meat, and I think that all the people that I ate with are those people in the very top category here. So my conclusions, US imports are retailed as lean, low value, and small portions. The distribution and fat vary, but only for pork. The cuts vary with city, again, only for pork. And what we know is that the local meat that we produce is actually as lean, if not leaner, than the meat that we're importing. The differences are small but significant, but they're complementary. So we're able to meet the preferences of the consumers. Now, to finish off, I actually want to go through a couple of things that I think could be future projects. When I started this project, someone explained to me that often the US imports are in a separate case or separate shelf from the Mexican meat. And for me, this is really interesting. I've never seen this before. And I wondered who decided that it should be separated and why. Was it US Meat Export Federation? Was it the local retailers? And why is it? Is it because the cuts are different? If they're visually different, if one has really white fat and one has really yellow fat, then Maria's not agreeing with me, but if there's visual differences, then that would explain, because you don't want something that's quite different sitting next to your local meat in the meat market, for example. If the cost is really, really different, you also don't want them sitting next to each other. Or is it a status kind of thing? I'm not sure. And does this occur with other products? Is it just with meat, or are there other food products that they separate out and advertise in? And I think it would be really interesting to understand what the consumer does. Do they go to the supermarket and decide at the supermarket, okay, today I'm going to buy US meat? Or do they get there and think, okay, there's no chuleta in Mexican meat today, so I'm going to go and look in the US meat? Or what is the consumer doing? Are they making up their mind before they go to the supermarket, or are they doing it at the supermarket? Are they doing it 2 seconds before they choose their piece of meat? And why do they choose US meat, or why do they choose Mexican meat? There's one more slide. The other thing I wanted to mention is that normally, and this goes with the separating the meat out, normally when you study consumers in a country, they have a very strong bias towards their own products, even if their own products are not as good as what comes from another country. In Quebec, you would not find US meat labeled and separated as US meat because nobody would buy it. In Quebec, we did a study with about 300 consumers, and only about 3 consumers knew that US meat was sold in their supermarket, and all supermarkets in Quebec have US meat. So we almost hide the fact that it comes from the US. There are exceptions, of course, so things like Swiss chocolate, Canadian maple syrup, New Zealand lamb, Mexican tequila. People would never believe that tequila from Canada is as good as tequila from Mexico, for example. So there are exceptions to the rule, but I think it would be really interesting to understand what the Mexican consumer thinks of the US meat or US brand in general. And even though I know that the US is doing a whole lot of horrible things politically at the moment to Mexico, in terms of a scientist, it's a really exciting time to go out and see if Mexican perceptions are changing towards the US brand. The other thing that I know is that I did a study at the beginning of my time in Canada where we were looking at the Canadian brand. And we went to a lot of different countries and we asked people, what do you think of the Canadian brand? So if you put a maple flag on a piece of meat, what sort of perceptions does that invoke? But to do that sort of study, you also ask about the country that you're studying it in. So Italy, you ask about Italian products. And then you ask about a whole lot of other countries. And what we found is in Italy, France, Sweden, Great Britain, they came out with always that their country was by far the best. But in Germany, for some reason, they're like, no, bread from France is great and cheese from the Netherlands is great. And the Germans don't have that sort of strong local bias. So I wonder if the Mexican consumer has a similar flexibility. I don't know. I think that these would be interesting things to study. So, I just want to say thank you to Nelson and all his team for letting me be a part of this project, to Maria and Diego, and to Alma also for letting me do projects with them in the past. Thank you. And I love coming to Mexico, so thank you, Enrique.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Questions after the We Connect with team to
Yep,
rescue
okay.
the
Yeah, because
presentation.
he's still there, I think.
Gracias.